name is Monique Knapen, and as director of the John Adams Institute, I am proud to have Peter Gay in our program tonight. As most of you know, the John Adams Institute organizes lectures with American speakers with various backgrounds. We alternate literary events with evenings with a specialist in their own field. Peter Gay is such a specialist. He is a historian, emeritus professor at Yale, and psychoanalyst. In a moment, Peter Gay will talk about a subject he's currently working on, modernism. But before we ask him to do so, Herman Beliën, historian at the University of Amsterdam, will introduce our guest of tonight in a more detailed perspective that historians are used to. After Peter Gay's talk, which will take about 40 minutes, Herman Beliën and Peter Gay will have a discussion, and at a certain point, you will be invited to ask questions too. And then again, practical point, please use a microphone. There is, I think, a mobile microphone around to raise your questions. I think we'll close at around 9:45, if Herman is strict on time. And after that, Peter Gay will sign his books. But before he will do so, I will be back here and close the evening. Herman, may I ask you to take the floor? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me every time to introduce Peter Gay. I'm a fan. I will be honest about it. I'm one of his fans, and many fans in the world of history. And as an introduction, I will tell you the story about my encounters with Peter Gay. The first moment I met him, not in person, but as a text, was 1968. It was a very uneasy year. Here in Amsterdam, students took over the main administration building of the university. And at my department, the Department of History, the staff, I was a young student, tried to keep us quiet by inventing a very useful way of staying inside to study very important and relevant, that's a special term of the 60s, relevant literature. We got a number of articles, and I immediately understood that my way to science was a long one. The first articles I couldn't understand. They were written by members of a school in Frankfurt, and this Frankfurter Schule was way above my level. But then suddenly, in the package, there were two American texts. One written by Carl Becker, and the other one a much younger critic of his, Peter Gay. The idea was that we should discuss a problem that was discussed in the papers, namely, when did our modern world have a beginning? Did it start, like Carl Becker said, in, let's say, around 1900, with all those new inventions, discoveries in physics? Or was he totally wrong, as Mr. Gay said, because Mr. Gay defended the thesis that our world started in the Enlightenment? I did only know the text. I immediately had to choose, and I chose for Becker. Later, I read his 2 volumes, the 2 books on the Enlightenment, and changed parties. I immediately discovered not only his critical acumen in fighting his enemy, Becker, but also the other qualities by which he is a great historian in my view. He is a brilliant storyteller. He is a great writer. But the stories are always woven around an explanatory framework. And he is a lover of big questions. It's not the small detail, it's about big questions. The Enlightenment book placed the little flock of 18th century philosophers in a dialectical framework. They battled against traditional Christianity, recognized like-minded minds in classical antiquity, and discovered modernity. And modernity was the term about the discussion was all about in the articles. I met him in person in the beginning of the 80s. In the meantime, I was a member of the history department of the University of Amsterdam and was employed as an organizer for a committee of a conference. The theme of the conference was the crossing of boundaries in the field of humanities and science. Peter Gay was one of the 3 persons invited. In the work of those 3 people, boundaries were actually crossed. He was a very respectful historian in my field, but had in the meantime crossed the border of my profession. He was educated as a psychoanalyst. And then from that moment on, he practiced history informed by psychoanalysis. He doesn't call himself a psychohistorian. Maybe we can come back to that problem later. He had, in the meantime, changed subjects. He could, of course, choose the path to glory to write another book about the Enlightenment, but he skipped the Enlightenment. Not wholly, but he went over to a new big question. Was the traditional image of the 19th century Victorian bourgeoisie right or wrong? As an example, was the British advice about feminine sexuality, lay back and think of England, a myth, or was it a description of reality? 5 thick and heavy volumes and a book, 5 volumes about the main passions, and a book that can be read as the synthesis, while it is at the same time a story about Schnitzler. The last book is now available in a Dutch translation, have been written about this question. He did this in 20 years. Subjects have changed during his career, but his approach is still the same. A great narrative, always conscious of the steps in his historical reasoning. That will be the same in his new project, A History of Modernism. Tonight, he will review the work he did on the bourgeoisie in the last 20 years and speculate about his new work. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Gay.
I think I'll take this one, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can use this one.
If I'm a little stiff, it has to do with my back and no other. But let me get rid of this, okay? Thanks. Well, I'm very glad to be here and very glad to be speaking to you, the John Adams Society. As you know, of course, John Adams is coming back, having been somewhat neglected by the Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians, and so I would hope that someday the great, or at least not great, diligent new biographer, McCullough, will come and speak to you about that. It is not my field, although my interest in Adams goes back to the days when I worked on the philosophes as well as the American political theorists who managed, of course, for the most part, to become president of the United States. This is not about today, but I think you may have noticed that our current president is not a philosopher. Now, so I'm very glad to be here, and I even have some notes so that I won't get too confused. Now, the occasion of my visit here, by the way, is this clear in the back? Can you hear me with this? Yeah, okay. Is the publication of a Dutch edition of a book I published in the United States last year called Schnitzler's Century, which is an attempt to summarize what these 5 fat volumes that Herman was talking about explain or express in a certain amount of detail. In that last volume, which in a way is different in scale, attempts to bring together all the things and even more of the things that I talked about in the 20-odd years before then. I try to give a kind of picture of middle-class culture, leaving out most of the things that historians tend to include, such as politics and war and reigns and so on. And in that book, you will find, if you buy it, of course it is understood that you will buy it and not take it out of the library. If in that book you will discover a chapter on art and taste. And that chapter also includes some material, rather brief, on modernism. And it is following up on those pages that I've now begun to work on the problem and the question of modernism. And it's a question that I have not really solved very well yet, that I may even never solve, although I do have a decent advance, and so I better produce something. But I'm at the beginning. I've only been working on this for about a year, and I'm not sure whether I'll be able to solve the questions that I've set for myself. I would like to talk about them all. Now, the first question to be raised about modernism is whether a word like that, comprehensive, collective term, makes any sense at all. You know, in the history of ideas, the question of whether generalizations do make sense or not is often a vexed one. In 1923, at a dinner of the Modern Language Association, an American historian of philosophy, Arthur Lovejoy, gave a talk called On the Discrimination of Romanticisms. And by the time he was through, his appalled audience had discovered that they could no longer talk about Romanticism, because every conceivable thing you could think of was included in it, going all the way back, not only to Plato, but indeed the Bible. So the question of generalization, when you are dealing with large questions, comes up and is bound to be difficult to deal with. As a matter of fact, while there's almost nothing in the literature on modernism that goes beyond a single art or bit of literature, poetry or painting or whatnot, nearly all the statements made on modernism are in the plural. And the idea is that you talk about modernisms and thereby evade the problem that I myself am trying to face. Now the question is, how is one to talk about modernism in the singular? And that is the question that I would like to address tonight and see whether it makes any sense to you at all. If not, don't hesitate to let me know, because I'm far away from home and my editor doesn't even know I'm here. Now, the question that needs to be answered right off is, are there any unifying characteristics or qualities or principles that would bring all these modernisms together? It would be okay, presumably, to write a book on modernism in painting. It's been done. Modernism in poetry or the novel, that also has been done, though not yet very much. But what about all of them put together? After all, how can we do this without giving you, the reader, a bunch of potted biographies? You know, 3 pages on Schoenberg and 4 pages on Virginia Woolf, and then a quick list of the titles of the books or the quartets written by them and so forth, which is hardly interesting, and any encyclopedia can do it for you. But if you have a unifying principle, how can you deal with that without neglecting variations and differences? Because one thing is very clear, is that modernists often did not like other modernists at all, or not much. For example, Virginia Woolf was, although she admired part of the literary energy of James Joyce, thought he was not really the ideal solution for the modern novel, because he was too obscene, and he was, in her famous simile of hers, so anxious to get air that he would have to break the windows. This was not her style. Again, you can do this over and over again. A modernist composer like Richard Strauss, for example, who helped Schönberg to come to Berlin after Vienna had become too hot for this radical composer, soon decided that what Schönberg was composing was nothing more than garbage, and that it was probably the right word for it. As I say, I could give you dozens of examples, but that will take more than 40 minutes. Probably the most extreme example of this is Salvador Dali, who made the point that his job was to rescue modern painting from all that modernist nonsense that you saw around you in the galleries and even in museums. So then, what then can we say about modernism? Can we say that modernists are all interested in war against the establishment? Well, a lot of them are, and a lot of them are not. For example, Baudelaire, who is one of my first examples and one of the most interesting of modernists, one of the early ones, of course, Baudelaire dedicated his salon, that is to say his review of paintings in the mid-50s in Paris, to the bourgeoisie, which he said was the very class, indeed the only class that could rescue modern poetry and modern art, because it had the money and it was giving the money to found museums, to establish large art galleries where people might walk in and perhaps acquire one or another work of art. This kind of becoming friendly with the bourgeoisie, which is presumably the enemy of all modernism, makes you stop and say, combat is an interesting example of what you might say, but it's not strong enough. Well, what about politics? What about modernist politics? Well, there the situation is even more desperate, because modernists, recognized modernists whom we will all agree on as being modernists, are all over the place politically, from right to left and in the middle. There is no such thing as a kind of favored kind of political attitude or political thought that modernists could be saddled with. Of course, you might say that most of them are uninterested in ordinary people, ordinary ideas, things that are not too sensational. Maybe that's it. But on the other hand, you have members of the Communist Party. I remind you of Picasso's Doves, for example, and his sentimental view that Stalin was on the whole a good type, and Nazis like Knut Hamsun, one of whose most remarkable pieces of work was an obituary that he wrote in early May 1945 for Hitler, who will be regarded as a rather interesting statesman. And lots of things in between. To take the argument that modernists are all arrogant and all despise the bourgeoisie works for some people, and beautifully indeed. The best example of that would be French novelists like Flaubert, for example, who was so hostile to what he called the bourgeoisie that it included everybody in that except a dozen or so people who were his friends and with whom he had dinner at Marnier in Paris, or maybe Georges Sand. That is to say, some exceptions, but millions of bourgeois, working men, aristocrats, bourgeois, as we would call them, and so on. So in other words, the political angle does not work either. Well then, what can we deal with and stay with it and be content? The answer is I don't know. I don't know yet. I have ideas, and I trust that you will take them to be provisional and tentative, and I can think of three things I would like to say here that might help to characterize what modernists are. Now, by the way, before I give you that list of three, I could say that I could name some names to you, and then these names would evoke in you, whether you know that painter or poet or something very well, the feeling, yes, that's a modernist. Specific examples work. I've mentioned Virginia Woolf. I would mention James Joyce or T.S. Eliot or Schoenberg Nijinsky, Stravinsky, and some others like that. We can also say that people working in the late 19th and 20th century who worked with the general establishment, whatever it was, poetry or painting or whatever else, were not modernists. But the question is, of course, is that enough to hang a whole book on? And my own sense is it is not. So I would suggest then three possible ways of looking at this whole question of modernism without specifying precisely when it was born and without specifying also when or whether it has died. It's very, very hard to say. In fact, my tentative subtitle, the book I think I will call Modernism, which seems clear enough, and I think I will call it The Shock of the New, from Baudelaire to Bilbao. So when we talk about Bilbao, you're talking about a piece of architecture that's still almost brand new. By the way, let me ask, how many of you have seen the Gehry Guggenheim? Well, just a few of you. Well, there's room for more. It's pretty extraordinary, and it worked very well and made me feel that modernism was not yet quite dead, although it's showing heavy signs of being in trouble. Now, the first, I would say, is a question that has to be dealt with from the point of view of social and cultural history. That is to say, modernism is possible, by which I mean in general the defiance of tradition, whether once again in academic painting or the kind of poetry familiar to us from the past and so forth, or architecture, which in some important ways is new and shocking, and the word shocking is important here. How is that possible? How does modernism, how can, let's say, a culture permit modernism to emerge and survive? And I would argue, without being a determinist or economic determinist, I would argue that you might say something like this, that you need, in a given culture or society, if you like a more modest word, a class, presumably a middle class, of professional men and women, or people who are well-to-do without perhaps even working, strong enough, opinionated enough, and wealthy enough to buy stuff that is not standard and is not offered to you, say, in a salon. So that is to say, when Meissonier paintings in Paris at the salon would fetch 50 to 60,000 francs, as they did, a young painter like Monet was very glad to get rid of his paintings at 300 francs a piece. To the deducting, by the way, you have to deduct also the commission, of course, of the dealer. Now, that will be the first, and it's perfectly obvious, but it is something that we, I think, must begin with. The second thing that seems to be essential to make it possible, not to guarantee, but to make it possible for modernism to emerge and to survive, would be a political situation which is loose enough, liberal enough, whatever that may mean, to permit certain kinds of disrespectful kind of painting. If you think, for example, that you have an African painter who does a portrait of the Virgin using elephant dung for one of her breasts and have no problem with it, then you say you have a society in which modernism, good or bad, by the way, will indeed survive. Now, the former mayor of the city of New York did, in fact, try to stop that picture from being shown, but failed because the courts wouldn't let him proceed. But that's the kind of thing that I have in mind. When you have a society in which, and this is perfectly obvious, say, with totalitarian societies, in which you have a prescribed style, in which any other style will be called dangerous or decadent, the Art der Kunst exhibition in Nazi Germany in 1937 as a perfect example, modernism will not survive except in private. Nolde, the German expressionist painter, for whom I have no pity particularly, because he was dying to be admitted to the Nazi party and didn't want him because they didn't like these wild pictures, did a lot of so-called unpainted paintings. He painted them, they were little, and he kept them at home, and they weren't shown until after 1945. But that's, of course, an extreme example which suggests that the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Franco Spain, are places where certain kinds of art or literature are simply not tolerated. And in those places, this is an obvious thing to say, in those places then modernism will not flourish. Things get a little more complicated, though, when you have a kind of partial repression of this kind of art. Example, 19th century France. When in 1830, the new king after the revolution of 1830 of France, Louis Philippe, came to the throne, he guaranteed the freedom of the press, which included, of course, nasty cartoons about him, showing him to be in that notorious way in which Daumier and Philippon did this, showing him as that big-assed pear, and the pear became then the symbol of Louis Philippe, the misnamed bourgeois king. Now, in 1834, after an attempt on his life, the government changed its mind, and you had very severe press laws which went into effect immediately. This meant that Daumier could no longer do the king directly. He could do it indirectly. He could invent certain crooked French characters, Ratapoil and others, and thereby become or remain a political critic, always hoping that the government or that these institutions would not stop you. But then there were attempts by the government again and again to restrict certain kinds of poetry, certain kinds of novelty writing. A key instance of this, or two of them, come in 1857 in France. In early 1857, Flaubert, his printer, and his publisher were tried for obscenity and blasphemy for 4 passages in Madame Bovary. And in a rather well-known trial, the printer, the publisher, and the author were in fact acquitted. This was by no means clear. And by the way, one of the things that is so interesting historically is where are the boundaries in regimes of this kind? Very often you know what the boundaries are only after you've defied them or crossed them, because very often the government itself doesn't know what is or is not permitted. Half a year later, the same prosecuting attorney tried his luck with Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal and had better luck. The court found 6 of the poems in that book to be obscene and ordered the author to pay a fine of 300 francs and the publisher to republish this book only if these 6 offending poems were omitted. And I think that much in the 19th century is this kind of halfway house of acceptance and repression. And so therefore you have to move really from state to state, or for that matter, ruler to ruler. The current mayor of the city of New York couldn't care less about what the Brooklyn Museum puts on its walls, and as far as artists are concerned, this is, a new age of freedom. Now, this kind of question, the political situation that is required to permit you to step out of line, when you're not even sure exactly what the line is. The Nazis and the Soviets made perfectly clear what their lines were, and you better have a heroic Soviet painting of Stalin rather than anything else. Well, this then would be the second element in what I would call the necessary prerequisites. But then there's something else, and that something else strikes me as pretty subtle and may very well be too subtle for me. I'm thinking about it, but I won't guarantee you anything. If you invite me again 5 years from now, I might be able to tell you, but at the moment I'm not clear. And that has to do with a certain cultural attitude towards authority as such. Not just the government, which will prohibit you from, say, publishing something or painting something or putting something on stage, but rather a culture in which, for some reason, there is hospitality towards the unusual, and indeed the word shocking again. This is very hard to quantify, very hard to deal with. We know, for example, that in Britain in the 19th century, plays were censored by the court chamberlain, and it was his job, the Lord Chamberlain, it was his job to stop certain plays from being performed. And they would close plays if the Prime Minister was mentioned by name, if Her Majesty the Queen was mentioned or lampooned in any way, religious questions were not to be raised, and so on. And there was a legal basis then for closing down, even for that matter, Gilbert and Sullivan, though the government in Britain had the brains not to do that. Because then you send them underground and you have private clubs. This, by the way, is how Ibsen, for the most part, was performed in late 19th century Britain, in private clubs over which the state had no particular control. Now, I would argue that in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, and in the 20th, for part of the time, this triple looseness in economics, politics, and, if you wish, cultural openness were available. This last has, I think, to do in part, and this is a very risky thing to raise, with what I would call a post-Christian world. I mean, I would be the first to admit that religion hasn't died yet, and certainly in the United States, and seems to have a certain vitality here, though I think I'm glad I envy you for this rather less than it does at home. But on the other hand, it is the case that the 19th century has a great deal of falling away from the standard denominations, whether Catholic or Protestant or Jewish for that matter. And what you also get is the invention of a number of new religions, which are substitutes for Christianity in some way or another. I invite you to keep in mind for just a moment Mary Baker Eddy, who had a brilliant thought, I mean, she would have been a great public relations person if she'd lived a little later, of inventing something called Christian Science. Here is a religion with a kind of Bible all its own, which has science, which is popular and powerful, and Christianity, which is that as well. In addition, you get spiritualism of the most varied kinds, from the most primitive table-moving and or Madame Blavatsky's extremely ambitious synthesis, as she called it, of religion, philosophy, and science, thereby giving up nothing and no one as far as she was concerned. Now, these spiritualisms become in part highly sophisticated, and certain scientists who don't believe that maybe materialism a la Darwin pushed a little bit, because Darwin was almost definitely, if not completely, a materialist in the technical sense of that word, and certainly so was Huxley, that this was somehow empty, that it left something spiritual, to use that word, unanswered, unfulfilled, and that therefore, however scientific you might want to be, you shouldn't push it all the way. I call your attention to the fact that someone as remarkable a philosopher and psychologist named William James did precisely that. In the Varieties of Religious Experience, one of the great documents, the Gifford Lectures that he gave in 1902, he gives you a brilliant summary of a large variety of special religious experiences. But he ends up then saying, but without something higher than us all, he calls it the oversoul, or one or two other words like that, life is hardly worth living. And so he therefore thought maybe religion of some deeply spiritual kind had a future. Now, I do think that if you use that word, always with lots of footnotes beneath it, of course, saying there is a kind of post-Christian attempt to come to terms with what life needs and what life ought to have. Now then, these strike me as the three necessary prerequisites for modernism. Not the guarantee, of course not. What you have is artists who want to, defy the ordinary salon art and do something else. Then, if you do that, then you may discover that these three conditions are necessary. And if one of them is lacking, the others will also be lacking. In other words, the first of three things that I would suggest that belongs to any definition of modernism in the singular would be the existence of these preconditions. Secondly, I would suggest that what follows is the importance of heresy, unconventionality in technique. This is true for just about anyone who calls himself or herself a modernist. That is to say, write novels as they had not been written before, paint pictures that are somehow different from all the others. It is important to keep in mind here, by the way, that these exceptional people do that largely for some inner pressure that is impossible to deal with in general terms. I mean, all you need to do, this is a good place for it, since you have the museums for it, is to think of Mondrian. Mondrian starts out as a quite brilliant landscape artist of the most conventional kind, though not for long. And gradually his pictures, as you know, resemble outdoor nature less and less, until by the time of the war, with the plus and minus pictures, you could still say that this is a bridge, or this is the sea, and then by 1920, you have his rectangles. What you get in him is then psychologically very interesting kind of development of a retreat from or rejection of nature. By the way, Robert Motherwell, the American painter who helped keep Mondrian alive in New York, where he lived for the last 3-4 years of his life, till 44, broke all the time, once told me the following story. And that is that he, Motherwell, who was well off from his family, would take Mondrian out to dinner. And they would always go to the same place. Many of you have, if not been in that restaurant, will know where it is. It's called the Tavern on the Green, and it's at the edge of Central Park. And whenever they went there, Mondrian would insist to sit in such a way that he would face the doors and the windows of the restaurant, so he wouldn't have to look at all that greenery. Now, this kind of extreme rejection of nature, both in the pictures and apparently in his private life. That, by the way, is why he liked, when he liked to dance, the Charleston, which is a kind of dance where you don't touch your partner. Now, this can be dealt with and must be dealt with artist and writer by artist and writer. The same thing is true of Kandinsky. You go to Munich and go to the Lenbach House, and you can see Kandinsky in, say, 6 or 7 years, about 1903 to 1910, getting away from the landscapes and the Russian writers and the fairy tales that he's telling. They become harder and harder to read until you finally come up to a picture that, it turns out, doesn't owe anything to the outside world. I mean, you can try, if you want to, use it as a Rorschach test and say, yes, you see this or that thing, but he did not mean for you to do it. As a matter of fact, a famous anecdote about Kandinsky's paintings is relevant here because he tells us himself. It was in 1910, one evening after a long day in town in Munich, he came back to his studio, turned on the lights, and had leaning against the wall a painting that he could not recognize, and that made no sense to him. It was one of his own pictures, but he turned it sideways, and I think that this is the moment at which abstract art has finally conquered in Kandinsky. So this would be the second, a kind of technical daring everywhere and anywhere. You could show this if you want in film, architecture, any of the fields that would become necessary. And then there's a third element, I think, and with that one, one would have, I think, a pretty good idea of what modernism requires. Now here, again, I would have to move with a good deal of care because I'm very well aware that what I'm going to be saying in a moment is also true of earlier periods. But it's the conjunction of those three things I've mentioned, the preconditions, the technical daring, and finally, an extreme subjectivity. Now, subjectivity here means the ability, the desire and the ability to express yourself directly without necessarily, although at much time in poetry or in fiction in general, this may not be quite directly the case, is where you will work from the inside out. And if you ask, why do you need this? Why do you have to have your rectangle? And why not have ovals or for that matter, diagonals. You know that I will horribly mispronounce his name, but Duisburg is what's his name, the Dutch painter, who incurred Mondrian's displeasure because his rectangles didn't go like this, but they went like this, and that, of course, was not permissible. Now, not permissible because there was one person, Mondrian, who said so. And I think that the importance here lies in the willingness and the ability to belong to no particular school. Now, of course, it has to be said, it isn't always that way. And everything that I've said will have to be qualified by saying, I can think of at least 5 exceptions which are different, and this is certainly true. There was a number of years ago a famous cartoon in the New Yorker magazine. It showed an artist's studio, and there he was, all in a smock and looking full of paint on his smock indeed. And on the wall were hanging a number of completely incomprehensible scribbles. And there is a woman, clearly his woman, lambasting him. And she said, "Why must you be a nonconformist like everybody else?" Now, the major American critic, Harold Rosenberg, speaks of the herds of independent minds. And it is certainly possible to argue that some of the people who insist, as I say, on their own subjective primacy are indeed very dependent on other painters. How you can see this very directly if, for example, you take the great exhibition of Cézanne's in 1907, the year after he died. This was a revolutionary occasion for Paris because a considerable number of painters went there and went away saying, that is the kind of painting that we will want to do. And the relation of the Cézannes, mostly from the 90s and even from the first years of the 20th century, were paintings that have a direct relationship to Cubism, even though Cubism went its own way as well. Now then, I have spoken for nearly 40 minutes, and I will now just very briefly suggest to you a way in which we might look at this. I suggest that you could think of any one of any number of arts that will, in fact, make this kind of thing plausible. I've talked about some of them. I could give you many other examples. For example, and I've been discovering things as I go these days. There's a lot to learn, there are many books to read and pictures to look at and melodies to listen to. Knut Hamsun, as a young man, long before he thought this kind of rural, aristocratic, pro-Nazi sentiments that became so important to him later, Knut Hamsun, after about 5 or 6 years of almost total destitution, with 2 long visits to the United States, where he did the most lowly thing just barely to survive, and had done a certain amount of writing, including a strange, hostile book, by the way, about culture in the United States of 1889, came back to Oslo, where he had also been nearly starving for years, and decided to write a novel. That novel I regard as one of the great moments of modernism. I was totally amazed. I'd heard of him, of course, and I'd heard of his work, but this was something. It's called Hunger, and it's about the inner life of an artist, of course, Hamsun himself, who nearly starves to death and does not in the end, and leaves the city. There is, in works of this kind, virtually, of course, no plot, except moving from minute to minute, in which feelings, irrational desires and other things become central, and in which action, the so-called plot, becomes quite unimportant. Again, you can do this with dance, and you can do it with music. Again and again, some people deciding not to stay with what is conventionally selling and conventionally accepted, but moving somewhere else. Well, one final point, and then I'll leave the rest to Herman and to you. And that is that if you look at the way in which people consume modernism, you'll discover, interestingly enough, I think, that they will go a certain way in unconventionality and then stop, saying, this is enough or this is too much. There are numerous examples of that. I'll give you 2 of them. They're I put them in the book also that I've just published, or you've just published for me right here. The busy bee will, I hope, be very busy with my book as the next weeks go on. One of them is Mary Cassatt, who was a kind of revolutionary force for Americans in Paris. She was the daughter of an extremely well-to-do railroad owner, went to Paris, painted. She was the one and only American ever to paint an exhibit with the Impressionists, by the way, and she sold them, as it were, to her friends, rich like her, who came over, visited Paris, and she would say, "You've got to buy," and then she would say Courbet or Manet, and so on. Now, towards the end of her career, this changed, or rather she decided she couldn't stand anymore. She thought around 1910, 1912, that the fashion for Cézanne could not conceivably last because the guy couldn't draw. You know, if you've ever looked at a still life of Cézanne's, you will know that the table can't possibly stand up the way it's been drawn, and she found this very objectionable. She also thought Matisse was a complete fraud, a man with no talent who had decided to do some really weird stuff, like the Red Studio, for example, where, you know, what is wall and what is this kind of rural, aristocratic, pro-Nazi sentiments that became so important to him later. Knut Hamsun, after about 5 or 6 years of almost total destitution, with 2 long visits to the United States, where he did the most lowly thing just barely to survive, and had done a certain amount of writing, including a strange, hostile book, by the way, about culture in the United States of 1889, came back to Oslo, where he had also been nearly starving for years, and decided to write a novel. That novel I regard as one of the great moments of modernism. I was totally amazed. I'd heard of him, of course, and I'd heard of his work, but this was something. It's called Hunger, and it's about the inner life of an artist, of course, Hamsun himself, who nearly starves to death and does not in the end, and leaves the city. There is, in works of this kind, virtually, of course, no plot, except moving from minute to minute, in which feelings, irrational desires, and other things become central, and in which action, the so-called plot, becomes quite unimportant. Again, you can do this with dance, and you can do it with music. Again and again, some people deciding not to stay with what is conventionally selling and conventionally accepted, but moving somewhere else. Well, one final point, and then I'll leave the rest to Herman and to you. And that is that if you look at the way in which people consume modernism, you'll discover, interestingly enough, I think, that they will go a certain way in unconventionality and then stop, saying, this is enough or this is too much. There are numerous examples of that. I'll give you 2 of them. I put them in the book also that I've just published, or you've just published for me right here. The busy bee will, I hope, be very busy with my book as the next weeks go on. One of them is Mary Cassatt, who was a kind of revolutionary force for Americans in Paris. She was the daughter of an extremely well-to-do railroad owner, went to Paris, painted. She was the one and only American ever to paint an exhibit with the Impressionists, by the way, and she sold them, as it were, to her friends, rich like her, who came over, visited Paris, and she would say, "You've got to buy," and then she would say Courbet or Manet, and so on. Now, towards the end of her career, this changed, or rather she decided she couldn't stand anymore. She thought around 1910, 1912, that the fashion for Cézanne could not conceivably last because the guy couldn't draw. You know, if you've ever looked at a still life of Cézanne's, you will know that the table can't possibly stand up the way it's been drawn, and she found this very objectionable. She also thought Matisse was a complete fraud, a man with no talent who had decided to do some really weird stuff, like the Red Studio, for example, where what is wall and what is floor is indistinguishable, or if only to show that I too can do something that will make you sit up and notice. Another example of this was of particular interest to me, and I definitely did put this into the book, was Schnitzler. Schnitzler was a very avant-garde Austrian playwright, after all. He was willing to write about religious questions, above all, however, his favorite subject being infidelity and sexuality, and writing about that very freely, not always getting permission to stage his plays. He was very interested in music. He seems to have been a first-rate amateur pianist and played, with his mother, four-handed, by sight and all that, and went to all the modern recent developments. And one day he went to hear the second quartet of Schönberg's. And he came home and he wrote in his diary something like this: "I don't know what is going on. Bruckner was no problem for me. Mahler I greatly enjoyed. Should I fail now?" And that's to say, he could not enjoy or even take any interest in this weird kind of music that Schönberg was offering. A couple of years later, he finally settled what had happened, and that was that Schönberg was a fraud, a complete swindler, that's his word, and therefore there was no need to be impressed by Schönberg. Now, if you look at this, you could see, I think, the way in which avant-garde are themselves moving targets, and where you stop it, not always, but you stop at a certain point, and then you don't go along any further. Max Liebermann, probably the most interesting German painter, a kind of semi-impressionist in the 1890s and others, was notorious for his interest in avant-garde painting, learned a great deal from the French Impressionists, and was regarded as the apostle of ugliness because he was so far ahead of the rest of the German gang. By the 1920s, when he was head of the Berlin Academy of Arts, he gave a famous speech in which he said he was very glad to see how museum directors who had for the last few years bought into all that modern stuff, Fauve and abstractions and so on, had reduced their holdings as much as they could, had tried to get rid of them, and the rest was in the cellar so that nobody would be embarrassed by them. So then, in other words, the avant-garde is not simply an absolute no for people or for all people. It may be yes. As you keep on going, and gradually it will turn into no. Well, now that's as far as I've gotten. I've now talked exactly 40 minutes, and so, Herman, it's up to you. Is it working?
Well, we are here at a very particular moment. There are two major projects finished in your work, and now you explain the beginning of a third project. You started out by saying that in your modernity, in your basic understanding now at the moment of modernity, you could say that there are a lot of modernities, but you are looking for modernity as a central theme. Mm-hmm. And then you said it's very hard to fix a beginning or an end. And that's something that worries me a little bit, because in the earlier texts, for instance, on the Enlightenment, you fix a moment in the tradition of ideas in which you can say, well, actually, this is the point where those three movements in history, the battle of the philosophers against the Christians, the recognizing the classical examples as contemporaries, and at the same time the idea that they were progressing, that they were better than the ancients. And you come pretty close to a rather traditional beginning in the end of the 17th century. but you give it a position in a very long intellectual tradition. You really start with Plato. And of course, it is a position they take towards their own culture, which is bifocal. It's classical antiquity and Christianity. In the book on the bourgeois culture, there is a strong indication that 1815 is the year. I'm not sure, because you found out a rather different idea of what this culture was all about. And could you go into this question whether 1815 is a particular date? It is, of course, a different thing. It's about a culture as a whole. And the Enlightenment was a way of discussing, a way of reforming society. It's much more in the world of ideas. This is more in the world of coutume, of the norms and the values. Then you try to fix it to a specific date and try to find a kind of explanation for it in earlier times. Why isn't that possible in the modernity project as well?
Well, I think one answer is, of course, a helpless one. I don't know enough yet. I mean, if somebody were to say to me, well, you have got to go to the late 18th century because Kant was the first modernist, that wouldn't strike me as so crazy, because Kant's emphasis on human autonomy seems to be a very interesting way in which a secular person, an ordinary, if professors are ever ordinary, find themselves arguing for the primacy of the human, and that this is maybe an early modernist position. That you could do that. You could also use certain romantics, although then it gets complicated. These things get, of course they're complicated. Byron said he never did see the difference between romantic and classic. He thought, well, it just depended on personal taste. The reason I start with Baudelaire is because I think at that point the mass of what might be called modernism is sufficient to make a difference. I mean, Baudelaire made a great deal of difference in his poetry. His ability to take the most technical kind of poetry, the sonnet, and pour into it the most obscene kind of contents without writing pornography, for example. The fact that he was a brilliant reviewer of art exhibitions and writing about it, that on drug taking, it is very hard to beat his study of artificial paradises and so on. Baudelaire strikes me as the kind of father of a whole lot of things, and therefore having kind of wide cultural influences. In the 1920s, one at the time probably America's most prominent poet, that is to say Edna St. Vincent Millay, discovered Baudelaire and translated a number of his poems, and it was quite interesting that she should have done so. So I don't know. It may very well be that a starting, the question of whether starting point, ending points, does have to do with what it is you're trying to show. I don't know what the starting point exactly is, but I do know that if you look for, as it were, herds of independent minds, by the 1840s, you get a kind of decent group of them, right? Now, about the end. Well, in some sense, I would be willing to argue that it ended some time ago. Probably, let's say, this is tentative. I mean, I include, after all, Gehry among the modernists. But in the 1960s, Life magazine, then a weekly, printed a number of special reports on American artists, heavy Technicolor, 5 or 6 pages on Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, and so on. What was happening was that the governing middle class, if you wish, middle brow culture was being made to discover these painters whose real hope had been not to be successful. To be successful was the sure sign of having sold out, So it might be arguable that by the time And that does happen again and again, by the way. By the time Time Inc. decides that the country is ripe for Andy Warhol to show that everybody will be famous for 15 minutes, maybe that's the end of modernism. Where are you going to go from there? There's almost no place further to go. Still, the reason I am not willing to say modernism died is because once in a while you read things in the newspapers. And if I may, I'll tell you something I read in the New York Times a few months ago. There is an English artist named Damien Hirst, notorious for slicing up, sharks and presenting half a shark in formaldehyde and so on. And one of the really most outrageous producers of this kind of thing that the Brooklyn Museum could scare up and did. Well, Hirst has a gallery in London, and right now, I'm sorry I can't think of it, but he does have one. And they were going to have a Hirst show with a number of these outrageous inventions. And the night before the opening of that show, Hirst decided they going to have a big party, so guests were invited, and he showed up, and he said, I'll do something for this party. And in the hallway, he piled up an awful mess of things, a broom and paintbrushes and half-smoked cigarettes and butts and uneaten pieces of bread and all that, all heaped up. And it was called an artist's studio. That night, a cleaner cleaning up for the opening of the next morning came upon the artist studio and swept it all up. Now, I think if that's the case, maybe modernism's ability to shock is not completely gone.
Okay. One of the big problems, of course, in cultural history is to decide what's standard and what's exceptional. You already said that it was very hard in this case to distinguish modernisms, and there are even some strands of modernism you can't combine, really.
Right.
It's much more about a possibility, a number of possibilities that were created by those three preconditions. It's something that can develop in several ways. Let me go back as far as this is concerned. It's about the choosing of the mainstream and the exceptions.
Okay.
I want to go back to your books on the bourgeois. And first of all, it's about this huge discoveries of all kinds of material that didn't fit into the picture of the standard view on the bourgeoisie.
Right.
For instance, you found those beautiful diaries of women who were enjoying sex, which you wouldn't expect from the basic text that were written about 19th century sexuality. Then there has to be a moment in which you get to be convinced of the fact that this is actually the standard behavior. And what were the arguments for yourself to came out with this bold idea that it was all different than we expected, that actually the average was a kind of normal sex life, a sex life that I hope everybody would recognize. And of course, then it would be the proof that it was the normal one. And to give up the ideas of the former descriptions. How do you settle for this kind of new normalcy? Mm-hmm. How does a historian do that?
Well, yes, look, it's extremely difficult because what does modernist art depend on? Not just painting, sculpture, whatever else you may want to think of. It needs an audience that will keep it going. There are numerous publishers or ex-publishers who are not doing it because they can't, because they're not selling the things that they value, unless they have personal fortunes with which to nourish this losing business known as publishing. I don't know. You see, one of the things that happens is that the extreme becomes the normal in the course of time. I remember my girls, when they were teenage types, that they thought the Impressionists were just the cutest things in the world. And they would have reproductions of Degas and others on their wall. Now, they didn't feel shocked. These were pretty pictures. Well, it took quite a while before these pictures became pretty pictures, although if you've ever been to Giverny, you know that Monet, after a while, became an extremely prosperous painter because people were buying at very decent prices. So that one of the things that happens to avant-gardes, if you wish, modernist movements, is that they die out for want of fuel, or they may become commonplace. So that if it is the case, as we all know it is the case, that there are advertisements and book jackets that use Mondrian's rectangles, you have to say he's no longer quite so extreme in the general public's view as he was in the 1920s, when almost nobody was interested in what he was doing, except other artists and just a handful of patrons. It is the case, I think you're quite right in putting it this way, that what is extraordinary may become average. It may be bought or taken over or absorbed by a culture flexible enough, or if you wish, clever enough to do that, And certainly the Impressionists now are, if you look at Impressionists now with fresh eyes, no matter how careful you are about thinking of them as historic and historical events, that nowadays you're so used to them, you find nothing really shocking about this. This may not always be the case. I would say that if you go to Paris and look at Manet's Olympia, you still may very well be a little shocked, and as you should be, as he wanted you to be. So again, it's impossible, to predict. Just as the use of certain words in the language which are forbidden or not regarded as decent are suddenly become acceptable. Poor old New York Times, when the New York Times printed the Star report about President Clinton's behavior with his girlfriend, was suddenly printing words which, according to their masthead, they shouldn't have printed. All the news that's fit to print. But they were nevertheless fit to print because they were a government document. So all of a sudden, the New York Times is full of words which appear in no other story in the Times, that is, and haven't since. So it is a matter of situations. I am uncertain that there is such a thing as an end to something. When is the end of the Enlightenment? I don't really know if you could be so clear as to say it's 1799 with Napoleon or 1815 with the end of Napoleon or whatnot. It really depends so much on what it is that you're trying to grasp. Look, generalizations, all of us, we're not maybe all professional historians, we don't all worry about them a lot, but generalizations are essentially constructions that we use in order to make something clear. One thing is clear is that we have this in common. People who love to predict elections tend to talk about a kind of vote. Now, in my country, there's a great deal of talk about the suburban vote going Republican. Now, that is a vast generalization, which is untrue probably about 40% of the time. But something is being said here that is a collective statement is being made that is not meaningless, as long as you're not being doctrinaire, because it turns out some of your suburban friends are still Democrats and this sort of thing. So I would say the same thing about these big terms, is you have to be sure that you have a reason for saying that. And I would say the same thing about modernism. If it turns out that I'm wrong about all the things I said to you tonight, then I might as well give up on the book, or maybe I'll call it modernism in the plural, and and see whether that's acceptable. But I am thinking that there are some things which can be called modernist. And this is, even if they often have little to do with the others, that are also called that, they may have something significant in common. So from that point of view, I don't feel too bad about having no particular dates of beginning or ending. As I said, I was overwhelmed by Gary's building. I really was amazed. And I think I'm not that easily taken over, but that building absolutely got to me. I spent 2 days walking around it, walking in it, and coming back the second day very early so that the crowds wouldn't all come over. It was amazing to me that this thing could have been done. I had read Gary and I had seen pictures, but to experience it was really something worth doing. So that, I think, is a modernist triumph, that building. There are, I can't think of a lot of others like that. But, so I don't know if that's a good answer, but I couldn't be precise and say it's when Warhol died, it died and all that. Who is it? Is it Clark, Tony Clark, the English art historian, who has written a book called Death of an Idea, I think it's called, in which he says, yes, I can tell you when modernism died. It turns out to be November 9th, 1989. Well, I don't know. I mean, it was a big day, admittedly, but all of a sudden East Berliners were streaming into the West, looking at the department stores to say, my God, look at all the things they've got here. But what did it have to do with modernism? I don't know yet. I don't think he's right. So I would argue in favor of vagueness.
Okay. Let's try for another vagueness. There has been a time that cultural history, like you practice it, could use the idea of the zeitgeist. Mm-hmm. All those elements of culture were linked to each other, and as you know, the German philosopher Hegel, who was at the origin of the notion, he came up with the idea and was very successful in the 19th century, mm-hmm. and even in the 20th century. And I think a lot of us will think of it with a little bit of disappointment that it died. And that it died, you could say, because, for instance, Ernst Gombrich wrote an article, a brilliant essay, exactly, called In Search of Cultural History.
Right.
And he said goodbye to that idea. But at the same time, he said we should find other ways to link different elements of culture because they are related. What's your position about this whole idea of zeitgeist? Is it something you can do without? And can you give some examples how you try to link several modernisms and convince the reader that they are part of a single movement?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I've already pulled back a little bit from that by saying a lot of modernists dislike other modernists.
Yeah.
One of the interesting, I keep coming back to Mondrian for whatever inexplicable reason. Mondrian went to Paris and finally got a good look at the Picassos there. This was, I guess, in 1912. And said how disappointed he was in this painter who was so fertile, because there was the Cubist stuff, which was really quite nice, but he didn't have the guts to move to abstraction. Well, the answer to that one is that was Mondrian's idea, was to make something that is totally unrelated to external reality. It never occurred to Picasso. Picasso always wanted to keep some, toe, if you wish, or foot in the camp of realism, and leaving the possibility of saying, yes, I recognize that's a face, though much distorted, and so on. So I think it's true enough that people whom we would independently call modernists do not necessarily buy the whole thing either, My example, again, Mary Cassatt. Look, the trouble with zeitgeist is if it's taken the way Hegel did, very literally and seriously, namely that this is something that informs everything and everybody. I mean, it's true that in Iraq, you have elections in which the candidate gets 100%. But that's really quite rare, isn't it? So the Iraqi zeitgeist is at work here, no doubt. And he could have saved himself a lot of trouble without, he knew in advance he would get that. So, I mean, seriously, anything that you call the zeitgeist turns out to be first changeable. And a few years from now, you say, I wonder why we all believe that. And secondly, you didn't all believe it anyhow. That is to say, if you say, what? I don't know. The Victorian zeitgeist was prudishness about sex, let's say. Even those who believe that would have to say, but there are a few Victorians who were not, right? There was some struggle, there were some quarrels, there were minorities. And one of the things I think historians do try to do is to get our students to understand that life is more complicated than they make out to be. I mean, I think that is probably what I would have to say. In other words, I'm perfectly willing to, look, the idea though, the spirit of the age, you don't even have to be a German philosopher to use that language, right? It's used already by John Stuart Mill, who certainly had no use for Hegel, and stuck with the English romantics instead. But it's not a, if you take it to mean that you thereby have got everybody in your grip of a given population, all painters, all soccer players, all this and that, then the word zeitgeist doesn't help, because you won't. You just won't. I don't know. Arsenal is a team of heroes, but Bergkamp won't fly. Right? Yeah. So the zeitgeist of Arsenal is you can't take Bergkamp to Japan. I mean, seriously, I think that the importance is always in the minorities that are not captured by any vast generalization. And so, for example, when I wrote about the Enlightenment and talked about the Enlightenment and religion, I said, well, maybe if we can do it by generations, it'll be less improbable. So the first generation, Locke, and the generation that came close after him, like Voltaire, were deists. They did believe there was a God. He'd started the world and then stepped back and let, with all the legislation of moral and physical kind, everything else was up to human beings. Then there was a group of skeptics, like David Hume, who said you can't say anything really that is really convincing. And then comes another generation, Helvetius, Holbach, and so on, who are real atheists. They say they don't need deism, they don't need skepticism, they're too dogmatic for skepticism, and they're too critical of deism. And then you get people like Lessing, who invent whole new religions on their own. So all these are part of the Enlightenment's attitude towards religion. I've now given you 4 different, somewhat related, neighboring, let's say, sets of beliefs, so that Voltaire had no problem admiring people who were atheists, that they were on his side against, l'infâme. So écraser l'infâme, Holbach was as good for that as Frederick the Great. That he had no problem with. So I think that as long as you're prudent and cautious and keep thinking that what history really is exceptions. One vast mass of exceptions, and then you hope not to be too improbable. I realize that's very modest and accomplishment, but what can I do? I'm not a philosopher, so I have to do it that way.
Okay, I have a concluding question, something I want to ask you for a long time. On the one hand, you can look at your work as an academic historian, and you can ask yourself whether you read all the sources and made probable conjectures, and of course, that's the standard measure for historians. But on the other hand, you're a personality very much present in your texts. According to me, you have favorites, yes. And you found them in this long journey through the history of ideas.
Yes.
Enlightenment is good, and it should never end. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, by the way. We historians are taught by Ranke and others that we should enter into the ages in which we're studying, even though they're alien to us. I might say that Ranke himself did not do too good a job on this when it came to, before you get to the great powers. I think it was Lord Acton who said, Ranke is a great one for winners, but not for losers. This is one of E.H. Carr's bedeviling problems, by the way, in his history of the Soviet Union. But look, I have thought about this a lot, and I feel that absolute relativism, in which anything should be studied and found equally good with everything else, is not only impossible, it's really immoral. You know, Malcolm Bradbury wrote a wonderful book once called Eating People is Wrong. I think about this. I mean, I should be, as historian, I should be perfectly understanding of cannibals. Eating people may be right, who knows? But I really think that reason is better than unreason, and cannibalism is not as good as well-cooked steak. So I don't see why oh, no, that's really not fair. There's an American historian who's written a very good article on that subject, and I at the moment can't think of his name. The name of the article is Objectivity is Not Neutrality. And that is, I think, true. I mean, I think objectivity means trying to get it as straight as you possibly can. You know, even if you're looking for the complexities of a given personality that you despise or whatever, you ought to look for that. But that's fair enough. And once again, what makes your statement stand up or fall down is whether you can make your case, I think. So I don't believe that well, look, I believe that the philosophers, for example, were unjust to medieval Christianity. I think this is true. You don't have to be medievalist to believe this, and I've come to believe this. On the other hand, when I have to choose between atheists and religious people, I choose atheists. I think you don't have to agree with me, as long as you don't burn me for doing it. This is my point of view. And I think that a point of view needs to be grounded. You can't just say, well, this is my prejudice and all that sort of thing. Of course not. You know, the postmodernist critics of historians who go around, like Simon, for example, Simon Schama and others, go around saying, well, you know, we need alternate descriptions of things. The hell we do. If we have a description that is workable and persuasive and has evidence, I'd rather have this description than another one. And the notion of complete neutrality among all the forces in this world seems to me, you know, let's be nice to Hitler Day kind of thing. I don't think so. No. And you know, if you look at Kershaw's 2 volumes, he does try to make Nazi Germany and Hitler's Germany a kind of living thing that has a whole number of complicated things to be said about it, but it doesn't mean that he's neutral about Hitler, and I think that's fine. I don't, we have a certain common language when we talk about somebody as a villain that sounds very primitive and melodramatic, but I think it's a statement that can be defended. Okay. Historically.
Let's move to the second big project.
Oh.
The creators of the Vondelpark, the writing school at the Vondelpark, the Concertgebouw, the Rijksmuseum,
Yes.
the bourgeoisie.
Yes.
What did the study of this maligned class learn you? What did you learn from it? Are they the successors to the Enlightenment? Are they sympathetic to you as a class? Because of course they had a very bad press, not all too long ago, the bourgeoisie. Mm. Are they your favorites?
Well, I got Aristotle in my corner, so I feel, you know, pretty good shape here. But look, the importance of the founding of the Concertgebouw or the Rijksmuseum is part of the story the longer story, which I do very briefly mention in this particular volume too, in Schnitzler's Century, namely that there are different ways in which high culture was produced in the 19th century, and you have to do it country by country. You can't do it just simply say, it's always the government that does it. Not at all. My examples were, what I once did at great length, not in this book where it's quite brief, is to compare two cities, Manchester and Munich. And I asked the question, how did they get their museums and their orchestras? It was very simple. Munich got their its museums and orchestras because the Wittelsbach paid for them. That's why. And if you look at the Alte Pinakothek, you can still see the big sign of how they thanked the House of Wittelsbach for building the building and giving them all those nice pictures. Manchester doesn't have so aggressive a statement, but the Birmingham Museum, which is very much the same in founding as the Manchester one, says, by the gains of trade, we support art. I mean, that seems to me two different ways of doing it. In Manchester, as far as I can tell, not a penny of British government money ever went into the Halle Orchestra or their art museum or their university. The university was endowed by one person, a rich trader, who gave them something like £100,000. The only thing he insisted on, there be no religious tests for the students. So Manchester did that. When, in 1895, when Halle died, by the way, the Halle Orchestra was a personal property, it belonged to him and his family. And when he died, his widow said, what shall I do? And some of her friends, booksellers and others said, we'll take it over for you. In that year, there was founded in Manchester a Royal Conservatory to train new musicians. It's called the Royal Conservatory, but if you ask where did the money come from, the word royal was given to, upon request of the Manchester donors, but Her Majesty the Queen did not support this in any other way. It was nice to be called royal, but the money came from Manchester and Manchester money being made. Now, this had to do with the way in which the middle classes in Manchester behaved and how they behaved in Munich. In Munich, not until about the, maybe say 1880s, or maybe even a little later when you get the various rebels getting together in the secessions. For the most part, what the state does is what the culture they get. So how do we get Wagner? Ludwig II pays for him, although after a while, Ludwig, who wasn't that crazy, becomes very hesitant. Nevertheless, that is where the money came from. This was not true in Manchester. So we'd have to say that the bourgeoisie, again, parts of course, the activists among the bourgeoisie in Manchester did one thing. They say, we want an orchestra. So in 1848, they found this very nice German named Karl Halle, who had changed his name to Charles Halle. And during the revolution of 1848, he was unemployed, like so many other people, like Berlioz went to London to look for work. And they said, come on over here and we'll build you an orchestra. So he said, okay, and he became the director and the owner of the orchestra. Then you get an in-between thing. The Berlin Philharmonic was put together in the same way, and the decisions for conductors were made by the players. The Boston Symphony was founded essentially by one man, a man named Higginson, who had the money and stayed with it. Now you may say, I like this better than the other kind, but in a way that's not too relevant. What I'm saying is that before you generalize like crazy, these are the particular individual things you have to say. Otherwise, it just doesn't work.
Okay. I want to leave it to the floor.
Okay.
Questions, please. Yes, please, would you go, there are microphones. Would you go over there?
Yeah, there should be mic over there.
You want some water?
Yeah, sure.
I'm a musicologist, and in writings about modernist music, for a long time it was fashionable to emphasize in modernist music the rupture between modernist and pre-modernist music. And the last 10, 20 years it has become more or less fashionable not just to emphasize the rupture, but also the things that has remained, although in another form, How, in your writing about modernism, do you regard the relation between continuity and discontinuity?
You know, there are probably 7 or 8 areas in which I will have to have an opinion, God help me. And when it comes to music, I've got a problem. I am not a regular listener to modernist music. I will have to do that. I have friends who are musicologists who can help me to try to understand what happened. I don't know. It would seem as though, wouldn't it, as though the break between conventional music with key signatures and all that, and Schoenberg, Webern, and the others is very great. On the other hand, I've always been, as long as I've had a little thought about this, impressed by an article by Schoenberg called Brahms the Progressive, right? And so that in which, if I understand it correctly, Schoenberg says, no, you know, Brahms was not a reactionary. There's a lot of stuff in there that I could use and did use. So if that's the case, I am at the moment certainly, and it'll be a while before I can say anything with any authority, but I am aware of the fact that there is, surely everybody would agree that Schoenberg is a modernist. I have no problem with him at all. But if he says Brahms is sort of my grandfather, or I learned so much from Brahms. You know, he said, what was it? He orchestrated one of Brahms's quintets, I think, or whatever. The point is, he would argue for certain continuity, wouldn't he? Whether I could, I don't have really a very authoritative opinion at all about this, but I am aware it's not an easy one. You know, one of the problems about modern music, as distinct, let's say, from the modern theater or the modernist novel, is that its direct appeal to many of us, educated and trying our best, you know, not to be bigoted, is not an easy one. Again, let me give you a concrete example. Several years ago, there was a conference at Harvard about refugee musicians in the United States. And it's organized by Christian Wolff and Reinhold Brinkmann, and I came to know both of them very well, especially Brinkmann. Now, we had 3 days of papers, and I gave a sort of general paper about refugees. There were music by Kurt Weill that most of us had never heard. Mrs. Brinkmann sang some of his lieder and so on, and it was very remarkable. Well, one evening, it was a long conference, about 4 days. One evening, we had time off. And we were given a concert by Bilson and Levin on their 2 harpsichords playing Mozart. When it was, surely everybody would agree that Schoenberg is a modernist. I have no problem with him at all. But if he says Brahms is sort of my grandfather, or I learned so much from Brahms, you know, he said, what was it? He orchestrated one of Brahms's quintets, I think, or whatever. The point is, he would argue for certain continuity, wouldn't he? Whether I could, I don't have really a very authoritative opinion at all about this, but I am aware it's not an easy one. You know, one of the problems about modern music, as distinct, let's say, from the modern theater or the modernist novel, is that its direct appeal to many of us, educated and trying our best, you know, not to be bigoted, is not an easy one. Again, let me give you a concrete example. Several years ago, there was a conference at Harvard about refugee musicians in the United States. And it's organized by Christian Wolff and Reinhold Brinkmann, and I came to know both of them very well, especially Brinkmann. Now, we had 3 days of papers, and I gave a sort of general paper about refugees. There were music by Kurt Weill that most of us had never heard. Mrs. Brinkmann sang some of his lieder and so on, and it was very remarkable. Well, one evening, it was a long conference, about 4 days. One evening, we had time off, and we were given a concert by Bilson and Levin on their 2 harpsichords playing Mozart. When it was over, and I came back to New Haven. I wrote Brinkmann a letter, and we've been discussing this off and on for years. I said, you know, it was a wonderful conference. It was very elevating and very interesting, and we all were very sober. And when we walked out of that concert of Mozart, we were all smiling. What happened? Why is it that Schoenberg will not do that for us? And as I say, we haven't solved the question, but it is one of the things that is very, very difficult, isn't it? I mean, the distance of modern music from the, shall we say, ordinary music lover, like Schnitzler. I had no problem with Mahler, he said, but this guy is a fake, all right? So this is not likely to be the case with modernist literature, although the number of people who have read their way through Finnegans Wake is very small, and I'm not one of them, I have to tell you. Although I recently, when I began working on this, decided to sit down and read Ulysses once again, and I came to a remarkable conclusion. This is really a wonderful novel. You know, it's a wonderful novel. So, but I think as a musicologist, you probably will appreciate what I'm saying. I mean that it is harder for those of us who really don't like to be obtuse and Philistine and all that, to get something out of what, you know, you get from a modernist concert than, say, a modernist play. The relationship to the common understanding is somewhat closer. So, I can't really answer at all any better, but anyway, I'm very struck by the way in which Schoenberg was willing to see an ancestor who, you know, was kept on being maligned and through the 1870s and 80s because the music of the future was this other guy, you know, and the Wagnerites couldn't stop calling Brahms names for being so out of date and everything else. And the great stories about, you know, the workman at the exit, the Vienna Philharmonic, the London as well, saying the sign, putting up a sign in case of Brahms exit here and all that. You know, Schoenberg says nonsense. That's not true. Just listen. And of course, he was a pro and he knew what he was doing. So the answers, I don't know. Maybe someday I'll know. I don't know. Don't know yet.
Let's move to the second question.
I have a question about bad artists and whether any of them are modernists. You've told the Cassatt and Cézanne story and the Schnitzler and Schoenberg story, but those are kind of cheating because we all agree that, well, Cézanne clearly was great, so Cassatt must have been wrong. But are the Cassatts and the Schnitzlers ever right? And the reason I'm asking that is to bring in some sort of aesthetic judgment. In other words, just because someone's avant-garde and more or less conservative people hate them, well, that doesn't answer it, does it? Or does it?
No, not at all. I agree with you. What I'm saying, I'm really talking about reception. And what I'm saying is that you don't just have two parties. The totally conventional, who even think Berlioz is a little funny, and then the totally unconventional, who say, well, go way beyond Schoenberg. What I was suggesting was that to make life nice and complicated is that the consumption of art, music, film, whatever else, is a broad spectrum. I'm not defending Schnitzler or Mary Cassatt in the least. I was very amused when I first came upon that letter of hers, warning a rich friend of hers not to bother to buy, you know, Cézanne and Matisse, although the lady was in Paris to do just that and did. No, I'm not defending them at all, nor does it make it right. But what I'm suggesting is that it's not a two-party system. It's a multi-party kind of mess in which some people are willing to accept this but not that, that but not the next, and so on, you know. And I think historically it's very interesting to see how publics do this, deal with it. Of course, I mean, you can talk about the great Russian collectors like Shchukin and all that and say, you know, the man who collected Matisse and then invited Matisse to come over to Russia and paint more for him. Of course, it makes you feel that there's greater alertness, greater openness, and whatever else. I was not telling the story to justify them, but really to tell them in order to say there are many ways of responding, many. And I am not sure, in any case, nor would I be willing to argue that anything that's new is necessarily admirable. That would not be my point either. You want to have a certain kind of freedom of judgment as to how you feel about this painting or that. So that's what I was trying to do, you know?
Please use the microphone.
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish between the real modernists and the real frauds who are living in the same social conditions that you described?
Well, I mean, I'm willing to say that I would give you a catalog of, you know, certain numbers of people who've done certain things, and I would call them modernists particularly because they're willing to play with certain conventions, let's say, you know, it would be a very helpful one. This is where, let's say, I'm particularly interested in her because I've been rereading her over the last few months. I think Virginia Woolf's two greatest novels, among others, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, are really simply, as far as I'm concerned, masterpieces. And anybody who's not terribly excited about them, I just feel a little sorry for. That's all I can do. But she surely is a modernist in the sense that she is interested in, well, of course she wrote a great deal about literature, right? So she wrote a famous essay. It was a talk called Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. I don't know if you know that. It's a talk that she gave to a group of people at Cambridge and then published in the mid-20s, in which she argues that the three most famous English novelists then living, H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy, and Arnold Bennett, yes, are full of energy, full of goodwill, tell some good stories, but are ultimately very disappointing. Why? Because they don't get at the insides of people at all. They remain on the surface, and not that that's despicable, but it's not what the novel really ought to be doing. That's what she said. And she herself, in her novels, sees to it in a way that almost nothing happens. What mostly happens is feelings, which change in small situations in which the feelings are expressed or not expressed. So I would have no problem with that. I would have no problem with Hamsun, call him a modernist. But if you ask, for example, I just want to show you that I'm not really that dogmatic. Was Thomas Mann really a modernist? Well, it's a very tough question for me to answer. On the one hand, he is really the writer of the kind of family chronicle fashionable around 1900, especially among the Scandinavians. On the other hand, there is his famous or notorious irony, which is different from Jacobson and other novelists like that. So maybe you call him a modernist. I'm not, you know, again, I don't feel very sure. I would feel sure about Proust, of course, because of his way of digging into the interior. This subjectivity I've talked about is very different from Virginia Woolf's. But what is very interesting also is that Virginia Woolf only admired, well, she admired a number of people, of course, historically especially, but the only contemporary writer that I can think of whom she praises without criticism, so far as I've been able to find, is Proust. She thought it was just a pure delight to see what this man was doing with his characters. So I would say, fine, these are then unquestionable modernists. You can play with that as time goes by, and you can show that modernism, as I've said earlier, will be adapted or adopted or taken over, like Impressionism. I mean, if you look at the earliest reviews of the Impressionists, the first Impressionist show in 1872, when the Salon of the Independents, a number of people had really a lot of trouble with this stuff. They said, these are sketches, they're not finished. I mean, there are empty white spots there, a hasty kind of laying on of paint on the canvas. Surely he will give us something else. One of the reasons why they thought that was because to the conventional art critic, finish was absolutely essential. That was it. Eventually, once the Impressionists became popular, finish began to drop in significance. You know, that's how, in the passage of time, these things work. So nowadays, when you think of Impressionists, you don't think of them really as exceptional or rare or daring and all that. But if you look at contemporary critics, you can see that they really hit a lot of people the wrong way. They did not care for this kind of hasty painting. When Meissonier was famous for, you know, painting a uniform where every button was right, as they would say, every button. Well, in those days, he made money with those buttons, but times changed, and then people began to buy them, as you now know, looking at the auction prices, and they are now popular. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Yes, there will be room for one concluding question. You, please.
Professor Gay, I am a private researcher of comparative cultures, especially interactivity between arts and letters. Now, I've been close reading the collected works of Clement Greenberg, and I'll come back to that. And I'm coming back to the first question, continuity. Mm-hmm. Isn't perspective, Masaccio and so on, for Masaccio to say Picasso, more or less partial or gradual revolution, and isn't the great revolution, Magritte, of which Greenberg says he is the first who steps out, and isn't, so, for instance, Picasso just continuing to put paint on canvas and make another sort of perspective. And isn't there, and I'm following up this pearl in Greenberg's writings, of which much is sand, but I found this a real pearl. And this is not a hobby horse, because I'm too old to ride hobby horses. I would be thrown off. When Magritte paints his "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," this is not an apple. Isn't that a real revolution in that he combines arts and letters, and that he says it's not what you think? And mustn't we go on from there?
Meaning continuity more than what is he talking about?
Will we ask him to repeat it again?
Well, no, it was very hollow. I'm afraid the mic was very hard. I couldn't follow you, I'm sorry to say. If you could tell me, the microphone maybe hold a little further away from yourself. Let's try that. Because I didn't, no point in answering if I can't tell you.
What did I, was I unclear? Was I undistinct in some?
No, there's something about, can you understand?
No.
No.
What I'm trying to say is, in my opinion...
No, maybe I know a better solution. Maybe you could go to Professor Gay afterwards, because this will take too much time. I'm very sorry to have to...
Yeah, you have trouble too, okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
So, if you want to address Professor Gay later on in private, yes?
Yeah, I'll be here.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Peter Gay. I think it's time to close off. Thank you, Peter Gay, for your expose on your attempts to grasp modernism. Thank you for your wonderful examples, which prove you are, well, we already know that, but you are really a great storyteller, and thank you for the stories. Thank you, Herman, for giving your introduction. Thank you for having clear questions and bringing it to a broad audience. Before I ask Peter to sign books, I would like to express my gratitude towards publishing house, the Bezige, the Bezige. For it's really the translation, for co-organizing this event. I would also like to mention Book Importer Penguin, Books Benelux, and the University of Amsterdam for helping the John Adams Institute financially. As most of you know, we need all the help of partners, sponsors, and donors, since we are a non-profit organization. While we are regretfully rather poor on the financial side, hopefully you will agree we are rich in content and therefore well worth supporting. So, The John Adams Institute will take a break. We'll not have any events in December, I'm afraid, but we will start in 2003 with a completely different event. It's with poetry. We'll have a very controversial young writer and poet, Neil Pollock, in a program. And information about him and about the John Adams Institute you can find on the information table just outside this room. And please be so kind to drop off some of the questionnaires I hope you filled in today. And thank you all for coming, and hope to see you next year. Thank you.